Morning now, and it's up to me now to say less, get out of Derek's way. But let me just do a brief introduction. Derek is head of analytics at the learning measurement company. I first heard him talk on the excellent Good Practice podcast a couple of years ago, and I was struck at the time how well he positioned data analytics for learning and development, with some really great examples of his experience in analytics at Sky and Tesco. So I'm keen to find out even more, Derek, particularly today being the day after Google announced that it was launching its new career certificates in data analysis. It's almost as if they knew you were going to be speaking on the topic today, Derek. So I'm going to get out of the way now and hand over to you. I'll keep an eye on questions and things. Just on that, for folks, please put your questions into the question box that you'll see at the bottom of Derek's slides, and we'll pick up on those as we go. And there will be time for a Q&A at the end. So Derek, over to you.
Thank you very much, Neil, for the introduction, and welcome everybody to this session in my home, in a cupboard in my home, or it was a cupboard until around 2 months ago. What times we live in. So I'm in Falkirk in Scotland, which is between Edinburgh and Glasgow, and this is a great conference. Yesterday I was in Chicago with Kevin Yates, so welcome to two people from around the world. Now, I know for those of you who are currently working in L&D that your time is extremely precious. I also know that for those of you who are maybe not working in L&D currently, who are looking to the future, your time is also incredibly precious. So we want to make the most of that. Hopefully I will give you some fantastic techniques that you can take away with yourself. In order to get the most value from this session, I'm going to suggest that you use the chat box. I see lots of people already have, which is fantastic. You have lots of peers within this environment. So I suggest if you disagree with something, that you say you disagree. That if you have best practices that you would like to share them. Let's get a conversation going. That's the best use of our time, perhaps, as I share my thoughts around this stuff. So my background is that of an analyst. I worked for Sky, the Royal Bank of Scotland, and Tesco, looking at things like campaign effectiveness, customer behaviour, product performance, and employee performance. So everything I look at, I come at from a data perspective. I'm an analyst who's fallen into L&D, as opposed to someone from L&D who's falling into analytics. And we need more L&D people with L&D expertise within the field of analytics, because you've got fantastic perspective that you can bring. Okay, so what I like to do is take data and get from opinion and gut feel to actually fact-driven decisions that affect business KPIs. So I'm going to be talking around some of that as we go through this session. So, oh, my apologies. I'm still getting used to navigating this. Here we go. So there's a model that most of you will be very familiar with. Okay, and traditionally L&D functions use stepped models. Okay, so there's lots of models within L&D, and each step is often seen as an additional level of sophistication or complexity. And due to this, organisations often state that they struggle to prove the impact that learning has on the wider business. And so they tend to float around the lower levels of the pyramid, so the low to mid levels. If we take this from a data model approach, as opposed to a learning model approach, it becomes much easier because there are no levels. Okay, we just have different data sources. That we need to stitch together. In fact, from a data perspective, return on investment is one of the easiest areas because it tends to be wholly numerical. So we have averages and percentages and financial values, and computers are fantastic at crunching numbers. I'm going to argue that the most difficult bit is in fact using verbatim feedback, or at least using it consistently. And I'm then going to show you how an analyst approaches this. But before we do, I'd be curious to know how people perceive their own use of qualitative data. So we've got a poll that I'm hoping to solicit from you how confident you feel in using feedback in a meaningful way.
So already people are getting stuck into the poll. I think people have got used to this kind of approach in these sessions, Derek. So at the minute, it's a little confident is winning at the moment. We're getting a lot of excellent, good response. I think it's tailing off a little bit now. Getting some interesting comments coming through there. Hopefully, the audience is seeing those as well. We'll give it another 5-10 seconds, I think, and then I'll end the poll, I think, and then we can maybe just have a quick chat about what we're seeing in the discuss box, Derek. Yeah.
Sure.
So 5 seconds till I close the poll, people. I'll just give you a countdown. 4, 3, 2, 1, and we'll finish that there. So that closed on 48.4%, a little confident, 29% quite confident, very few, just under 5% super confident, and unsurprisingly, I guess, Derek, I actually thought this would have been higher, 17.5%, really not confident at all.
I am actually, sorry, I'm actually quite surprised by the results. I thought we were going to get lots of quite confidence, which is great because actually that means we can give you something in this session to hopefully make you feel move from a little confident to quite confident or indeed super confident.
Fantastic. Let me just very quickly have a quick look through the comments in the poll here. Garbage in, garbage out, says Poe. Depends upon the subject under discussion. Asking the right questions can be tricky. Phil's been doing it as part of his CIPD apprenticeship. Very good, Phil. So there's some interesting comments in there that we'll pick up on perhaps later. Back over to you, Derek.
Yep, I saw one of the comments that came up in the poll there, someone saying it depends on the question, I suppose. And we're going to look at questions because absolutely right, as is garbage in, garbage out, as is all the other statements that have been made within there. Bear with me, still navigating. I'm learning a driver here. So what we can see is we have a mix of views as to whether we're using qualitative feedback effectively. Okay, it is towards the lower end. But if we ignore the ideas of evaluation maturity and we could think about it in terms of a simple data model, although you can always make a simple model as complex as you wish, I suggested before we can also move from understanding business impact with very little effort. Okay. Most L&D models, broadly speaking, look at experience, confidence, and impact. And we will look at various elements of experience, various elements of confidence, various elements of impact. But broadly, all the models break down into these three areas. Experience being that which we might use to engage learners and reduce cognitive load. Okay, confidence being whether people know what they need to know, and impact, of course, being the difference that's brought about by the confidence and the experience combined. Given our time in this session, I want to focus on turning qualitative feedback into action. Now, some of you are super confident and feel you have this conquered, some of you don't, and I want to challenge the idea that many L&D functions have that they're capturing qualitative feedback well. And those who don't feel they're capturing it well, perhaps help. This is the area which, if looked at differently, will give you new insights immediately, and it will require next to no effort, which is obviously a great thing to know. It's also a large part of a good L&D data model, especially if we want to conduct analysis on which elements of a learner's experience might affect business outcomes. People feeling happy or well fed might not lead to better learning outcomes, but people feeling that an activity is worthwhile or informative might. Now, there's many ways of gathering feedback, okay? But there's some things that we should definitely not be doing when we're looking at soliciting feedback from our learners. I believe that if we gather information we're not going to use, it's just rude, okay? And it's a waste of our respondents' time. If we are not going to analyse the responses fairly and completely, we shouldn't be asking for them. If we ask different questions over a period of time, we can't compare responses from 6 months ago with responses from last week. Okay, so we will have no idea if we're removing barriers to quality learning. And if we ask different questions across different modalities, formats, or systems, we can't compare the responses of each. We will have no idea what's working for our respondents. So let's have a look at some common methodologies. As we know, there's lots of ways of looking at this, and you will have your preferred ones. Please engage with each other in the chat as we go through these to say if you're using this, if you agree with the pros and cons that I'm going to present, or if you've additional pros and cons for each of these things. So we might ask lots of questions that we think are important. Okay, how was the trainer? How was the environment? How was the food? Did you enjoy the material? Now, the pros of this is, of course, we get lots of data about lots of elements of learning from those who can be bothered responding and answering all the questions. There are downsides to this approach. Okay, so it assumes that we know what's important to a respondent. So if we are not asking a question about parking, for instance, but parking is annoying everyone who's turning up, then we're not necessarily going to know that. Responses to these questions can be very difficult to weight. Okay, so if someone says the trainer was fine, the environment was quite good, the food was delicious, okay, how do we know which of these things is most important to the learner? Now we can do things like count the number of words people have used and use their verbosity to look at how much effort they've put in as a proxy for how passionate they feel. That's one way of doing it, but it's quite difficult to do accurately. Although we often collect data within this format, we often don't act upon it because understanding it is time consuming. Trying to interpret 500 responses, 5,000 free text responses, to interpret that and analyse it at scale is very difficult, and it's also open to interpretation bias. We might have our learning material as our baby, think it's gone fantastically well, someone says it was fine, and we interpret that as fantastic. Okay, it can be quite difficult to do. Also, if we change any one of these questions at any point in the future, it can also render our historical results redundant, depending on what order questions come in and how they might affect how people respond. Another approach some people use is a binary thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay, now the pros for this is that it's really, really low effort for the learner. It's also really low effort for an analyst. Okay, what it does is it gives us a quantitative measure, so we can see very easily what proportion is positive and what proportion is negative. How many people liked it? How many people didn't like it? Now the downside for this is that we need enormous amounts of responses, so huge sample sizes, for us to have any validity within the responses, because what we will have is a huge number of false positives and a huge number of false negatives. Okay. Also, if we know the experience was good, or if we know the experience was bad, that's great, but this doesn't tell us why it was good or why it was bad, unless we happen to be running this along with a controlled trial where we know a variable which is changed, which might actually have affected the responses. So we have an NPS, or a Net Promoter Score type question, that's also used. Now, NPS was big in customer services a few years back. It's still popular in many places. And for those who don't know, this is where organisations ask customers, how likely are you to recommend us? And why is that? Those two questions essentially form an NPS style question. Now, the pros of an NPS question is it gives us both a quantitative measure, so it gives us an average star rating, or it gives us a score out of 10, or it takes away detractors from promoters. And it also gives us some qualitative feedback. So that can be quite powerful. The downside of this question is that it can be additional effort for the respondent because they have to answer 2 questions and the bottom question is free text. So how much do they have to put in there? It can be difficult to analyse. Again, if we get 500, 5,000, 50,000 responses, who analyses these? And also similar to the previous one, it's open to interpretation bias in any categorisation. So if someone says the training was fine, it was a bit slow, amazing food, were these all of equal importance to the respondent, or was the food the thing that was actually the most important thing to them? So looking at these methodologies, I would want to address some of the cons that relate to them, some of the downsides. Okay, and as an analyst, I like to have rules. So how might I get more value from responses with less effort? Let's assume that we have some basic rules. Okay, we want to make giving us responses easy for our learners. Okay, we don't want a barrier to entry. We don't want them to be bored filling out lots of questions. We want them to be able to tell us very simply what they think. We want to distill the essence of what's important to them down to as small a space as possible. Okay, it might be great that the course was too, or it might be bad that the course was too long, but the trainer was fantastic. I need to know that the course was too long. Okay, I want to be able to analyse responses consistently across all modalities and all periods of time. So I want to be able to look 6 months ago and look now and see what's happening. I want it to be as easy to look at 50,000 responses as it is to look at 5 responses. Okay, I want qualitative and quantitative measures or outputs from the responses because I want to know what proportion of people fall into certain categories and I want to know why that is. So I want the moon on a stick, basically. This sounds like we're going to ask some quite complex questions. So using these rules, it leads me to one question. Okay, and that's it. Okay, there's no stars, there's no ratings, there's no leading questions. Okay, describe your learning experience in one word. Now, I want our respondents to tell us the most important thing to them. Okay, and this question typically focuses responses down to a single adjective. Okay, an adjective being a descriptive word. I want the responses to have low effort. Well, this is just one word, so that's pretty low effort. I want our analysis to be easy and even automated. So regardless if responses are in the tens or the tens of thousands, this keeps our data really simple. And I want our analysis to be impartial. So from this response, I can let a machine interpret the response to categorize it for me rather than do it manually. How might we do this? Okay, so let's imagine we get some feedback from our respondents. And in this example, we have some responses. Now, using a very simple key, we can categorize these words into groups of positive and negative words in relation to L&D activity specifically. So I've made a key of around 8,000 words gathered from actual learners, which is available to download from this session. If there's not a link on screen just now, it'll be there at the end, so you can help yourself. And that contains a lot of misspellings, some of which are hilarious and some are simply bizarre. In this example, we've taken the word and not only turned it into a sentiment, positive or negative, but we've also turned it into a number. We can see the proportion of good and bad feedback that's been received. Now, if I was talking to a stakeholder, I might say, with a straight face and complete honesty, that most people thought that this was time well spent. And in fact, we've had people say that it was empowering. More importantly to that, I'd be looking at the most frequently occurring words within the negative column and be looking to address those internally of my function. So remember, we can use this across modalities, so we can start to see if people are using the same language for e-learning as they do for face-to-face or face mask to face mask, as is now potentially the case. I apologise for that. I am an analyst. My humour is not fantastic. So what we can see is we've got quantitative and actionable qualitative data from just one word. It's actionable because we know that people are saying it's too long, it's boring, it's repetitive, it is slow, so on and so forth. Okay. Now, there are a great many ways of understanding and undertaking this work to take words and categorize them. So I'm going to share a couple of easy ways. One way is easier than the other, and I'm going to use Excel to do this because most people are familiar with Excel, and if you're not an Excel master, there's a very good chance someone within your organization is. And in fact, we don't have to be Excel masters in order to undertake basic sentiment analysis and understand what our learners are saying to us. So, in order to conduct sentiment analysis, we need three things. So, we need a survey tool. Okay, now that could be Microsoft Forms, that could be SurveyMonkey, that could be within your LMS. I don't care. I'm tool agnostic. We need something to collect data, and this is something you probably already have in place. We also need an L&D specific sentiment lexicon, or a list of words that people use to describe L&D, which are categorized by positive or negative. The reason it's important that it's L&D specific, I often answer with an example that goes something like this. So if I was eating in a restaurant and someone said, "How did that meal make you feel?" and I say, "Sick," then that's probably not a great sentiment. That's not a great review of that restaurant. If someone said, "How was your experience as a surfer in the 90s in California?" and I said, "Sick," then that's probably positive. Okay, so context is absolutely key here. And as I say, we have one that you can download from this session, go away and play about with. We also need a reporting tool. Okay, so that can be Excel, it can be Microsoft Access, it can be Tableau, Power BI, SAS VA. There's lots and lots of tools on the market that let us look at data. I imagine most people will have Excel, so there's no barrier to entry for this stuff. So if we look at our first data source, which is the responses of a survey, okay, let's say it's gathered through Microsoft Forms. So we've captured a user ID and we've captured the date the survey response came in over here, and we've captured the modality of the learning experience. Perhaps this data's come from an LMS. We've captured the course name, and we've captured over here in column F the descriptive word that the person has submitted to us to describe their experience, which has probably distilled down that which is most important to them. So this is our first data source. Pretty simple. And of course, we might put other questions in there if we wanted to know about, if we specifically wanted to know about the trainer, or we specifically wanted to know about things we've seen in the past, which have been problems to our learners, and we're trying to do a deep dive on that. We might have lots of questions. The key thing being here, column F gives us a one-word descriptor of the overall experience. Our second data source is a list, 2 columns. The first column is a list of words that people might use to describe their learning. The second column is just whether we think that this is going to be positive or negative. Now, this lexicon may require some tweaking for your organisation. This has been used within service environments and sales, or collected and constructed from service environments, sales environments, and retail environments. But it might, if you're in manufacturing, the language might be different, right? People might use different language, so you can just add to the list or take away from the list or recategorize things as you wish to remove any potential bias. That's our second data set. Now, in order to understand which words people are using and understand the most common words people are using, what I've done is simply popped in a formula into column C of my lexicon, which counts the number of times the word in column A appears in column F of the other spreadsheet. Now I've got a little formula at the top here, and these slides are also available for download. I appreciate that looking at data on a screen and talking about formulas might be a little bit dry. It's worth going about and playing with, and this isn't the only way to do this within Excel. It's just one way. So what we can see is that we have 1,127 people describe it as interesting. We've had less people describe whatever experience that was as engaging. We've had 762 people describe it as engaging. Okay, a really good word and word we might want from our learners is informative. So we can see that nearly 3,000 of our learners have said informative. Again, to run the numbers on this, to produce this in Excel takes minutes, not hours, and you can reuse it over and over, and it's massively, massively scalable. What we might also want to do, once we've got our numbers in there and we know what words people are using to describe the experience and which the most common words are, we can then obviously within Excel throw on a filter at the top to show only the most common negative words. The most common negative words here are quick, boring, rushed, and long. Okay, so right away as an analyst, I would say there's something in there about our timing. Okay, things are too fast or they're too slow. We've had hundreds of people comment on this. The next thing I might want to do is look at that across modality to say, are people saying that face-to-face is too long and e-learning is too short, or vice versa? Either way, that gives me something that, that I can form a hypothesis around and I can go and explore further. I might want to overlay personnel data against this to see if that changes by demographic or by tenure, how long someone's worked in the company, so on and so forth. Moving beyond just understanding the frequency of words used and the most common words used, and being able to see the most common words which are positive and the most common words are negative, we might also want to turn that volumetric number, 3,000 for instance, into a proportion. So what proportion are positive and what proportion are negative? This is something we might want to put on a dashboard, or we might want to share with our stakeholders. I've popped another little formula over here which does a count. I've typed in positive and negative words in column E, and I've used this formula at the top to say if column B, which contains positive or negative, matches the word positive or negative in column E, give me a sum of column C, and that will tell me how many people have said positive and negative things, or give me a proportion. So I can see 92% of people have come out saying good things. I can also tell you specifically what those things were and what the most common things were, and I can then say what the most common things were by demographic if I so wanted. So that's a really simple way of conducting a sentiment analysis using unigrams or one word within Excel. There's lots of other ways. Of course, you could use pivot tables on the first sheet, and you guys can use the comments in the chat box to perhaps share other ways you could do it. There's probably much smarter ways. Another way of doing it out with Excel, I use Tableau a lot. So I've used the feedback data from learners, and I've joined that onto my lexicon or word list of positive and negative words. I've then used that as part of a bigger model. So I've connected that up. What we can see down here at the bottom is the qualitative data that's come from the feedback. I've joined that through the descriptive word onto the sentiment lexicon. Through user ID, I've joined performance data. So this might be KPI data, number of sales made, number of widgets produced, number of things picked off a shelf, whatever. Joined it on to learning data, so what material was consumed by learners. And I've also got some HR data in a model as well, so I can start to see some interesting things about populations. As I said at the start, this isn't going through steps of trying to let's get our qualitative data done, and then we'll move on to confidence data, and then we'll move on to ROI data. This all forms part of one model, and there's lots of material on my website around how to actually do this, and I'm always reachable through LinkedIn to talk about how to do this. I love talking about attaching the qualitative data to actual business outcomes. We don't have the time to do that full thing just now, sadly. So using that model, we can start to produce things that look like this dashboard here, a very simple dashboard, which at a high level will show me the proportion of positive and negative sentiment I'm getting from our learners. And it will tell us which are the most common or frequently used words within positive and negative phrases given to us. But I can then go on and click on females and see, do females differ from males? I can see females who are BAME and see, are they describing it the same as females who are not BAME? Okay, I can also do that by males, and in here I've popped in hair color, right? Do ginger people have the same vocabulary or use the same language as people with brunette hair? They may or they may not. The illustration here is we can use whatever we want, and we can slice and dice this data by modality, by time of year, by day of week, by gender, not necessarily that we'd want to do that, but more specifically by tenure, by experience level, and by performance pre-learning, so on and so forth.
There's been.
So
can you hear me? Okay,
that is how to conduct an sentiment
There's
analysis
been quite
using
a lot
unigrams
of
and take a really simple
in the
approach to
chat box
actually getting
and with
actionable
questions,
data from
Derek.
feedback.
Quite a lot of people
I'm
struggling a
happy to take
little
any
bit at
questions,
making
Neil,
the connection,
should
which
we
actually
have
I think
had
you've
some that
done
have
very
come up.
nicely towards the end in joining all these sources together to be able to get to business impact and ROI. I think some people were
Yes.
struggling a little bit about the rather binary look and feel of some of the data in moving into positive and negative, and struggled a little bit with understanding how that was going to lead into ROI. But as the title of this session very clearly says, this is about qualitative data, turning it back into something that's actionable. So there are some questions around all that. So things like, let me go to, so for example, there have been questions like, how do you motivate learners to give you the relevant feedback?
Right. Well, that's a great question. So one way of motivating them is by making the barrier to give us feedback very low effort. Okay, so if someone opens up a SurveyMonkey survey and they see 15 questions, they're less likely to complete that than they are if it's one question. Now, I often have conversations within an organisation when I say let's adopt this approach where we have one question out there, where we want to gather feedback from our learners. And there's always a want within a business to make it mandatory, right? To try and gather as much data as possible. I would rather have one honest answer from a respondent who wants to actually tell us what's important to them than 100 people saying okay or typing in okay because they've been told they have to give an answer. So in terms of motivating people, there's lots of ways to do it, right? You can say, there's a prize for the best response.
Apropos of nothing, Colin Welsh wants to know what guitar that is behind you.
There's ways to drive people to do the behaviour you want them to do. Personally, biggest motivator for me is make it really low.
And I'm sure that will mean something
low effort to respond. And your response rates go up if you.
So the question about data consistency,
you shouldn't be looking for 100% of responses.
Which is what about second language issues? You want just suggestion that
that is a Rickenbacker copy. That's an
if you're working with multilingual audiences.
Yeah. That's a very, very great point. Now this works across different languages. Okay, so at the minute the word list that's on there is 8,000 words in English and lots of misspellings in English, some crazy misspellings. You are right. Someone who's using English as a second language might not use the words we would expect them to use, but in most cases that should be a small proportion of overall. So what I do as an analyst is I look at this as a macro. I take a macro view. Okay, so if we take one set of feedback from one course, and let's say 10% of the attendees on that course had English as their second language, and we had let's say 100 responses. Okay, that might be quite interesting in itself. However, if we ask the same question across modalities, different modalities, and we ask it across a long period of time, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, we're not looking at 100 responses, okay? We're looking at 1,000 responses, 10,000 responses, in some cases 100,000 responses. And so actually that washes out, okay? Where people have misused words, what you will see is they fall down into if you think about this in a tree map, where we've got a big box for the most common words and we've got smaller boxes for the least common words, that tends to migrate down to smaller boxes, so you don't actually see that noise. Okay, that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is if you said, well, actually, we are running an organization and we work across different countries, okay, and people might want to give us feedback in different languages. So actually, asking people to describe something as informative maybe isn't that useful, because they want to say, and I don't speak any language, so I don't know informative in any. But let's say they put that in. What you would need to do is add to the English word list that's on here with words that your learners use. Now, this word list wasn't just born out of thin air. Okay, this grew over a long period of time of me asking this one question across different industries and different environments, and seeing the commonality of words from hundreds of thousands of responses. So I was able to say, okay, these 8,000 things are really, really common in the English language. So if we got a response that isn't in that 8,000, it's unlikely to make any difference to any analysis you do.
Some
one
commentary around
might use a word once that you're never going to see again.
Perhaps in
but if you want to use different languages, just append to the list.
Towards certain types of
frankly.
answers.
There's also other ways of doing it. I've gone through how to use it in Excel,
case,
but you can use things like Google,
how do you mitigate
Google
against
Analytics. There's lots of Google tools to do similar things. So again, I base this on population. So nudge, the use of nudge is fantastic, because it's great to hear people in L&D start thinking about behavioural science, where nudge comes from. If we think about nudge and removing, affecting people's behaviour by creating an environment where we drive the behaviour we want, by focusing people down to one question, rather than giving them lots of questions to answer, and by focusing them down to one word, which should be that word which is most important to them, we actually remove much of that bias themselves. So if someone wants to say something's rubbish, someone will say something's rubbish. Okay, if someone wants to say something was great, someone will say that something was great. Because we are asking them to distill stuff down. Okay, we're not trying to say, okay, tell us about your overall learning experience in whichever way you want, and then they're talking about the food and they're talking about the trainer, and because the trainer might read this, right? So we better be nice about them.
Fiona,
we're saying what's most important to you. And if they say friendly,
in the back of my mind, I saw this as being something quite repeatable.
Whatever.
So
we've kind of used nudge
would be the best. When is the best time to ask for this kind of feedback?
That removes much of the bias.
After the session, or would you?
But when we look at large enough samples,
I'm adding in,
that noise gets washed out.
Position this throughout a session? Is it something you revisit, or throughout a program even?
So, indeed. So personally, I would ask it once. I would ask it at the end of the session. Now, it might be worth issuing follow-up questions after a session. So let's say we get feedback from this one-word descriptor, okay? And we see that overall, people love the course, right? We've got high positive responses, but within a certain group, let's say under 25s, 50% of people have said it was boring, okay? What I might do is follow that up with a survey to that population specifically, exploring why it was boring. So we could then form a hypothesis and design a test or an experiment to say, if we do X in future, will it have less of our respondents saying that this is boring? Will it engage that cohort more than the treatment we delivered did? It might also be that when we look at the feedback we get, and we look at this in relation to performance improvements or performance change, we might see that lots of people say
Thank
it
you,
was
Derek.
boring.
I'm conscious of time, and I
Was
believe you
boring
wanted to
doesn't
go
matter.
to
It's not a
another
predictor of
poll
performance being any worse as a
go into
result
the wrap
or
up.
being any better as a result. So on its own, it's a great way of looking at qualitative data and getting actionable stuff. It forms part of a larger model, and it becomes even more powerful when we combine it with the performance data that we can quite easily do.
So the poll is open. Please dive in.
Indeed. So this poll
is
is very similar to the first one. When I say very similar, in fact, it's identical.
And
so I would
really
be
not
really interested to know how
is
confident
starting
that
to
you
drop,
now feel you are
which
using
is
feedback in a
good,
meaningful way.
I guess. Super confidence coming up a little bit more, I think. So comments that we're getting there, reassured that I'm still confident that we're not, said Annie. Stephanie, it was really illuminating. It's made me realize how much we need change. Annie says, work to be done. Chris, so I thought I was confident, and now I'm even more so. Paulette feels she needs to get her hands dirty and get more practice and get to understand the model. So I'm sure your website's full of useful information that would help there. So I think the poll, I won't close the poll. I'll just let it run because everybody can see the results. But we're over 50% are quite confident now, and a little confident at nearly 35%. So that's 85% on the positive side there.
Great. Awesome. We've moved the dial, and I'm always available on LinkedIn to talk about this stuff. If anyone's any questions about how to do it or you have difficulties.
So that list of
what we can
resources
hopefully
that Derek's referring to
see on the screen
down at the bottom
is that we've
left-hand
made some
corner
downloads available
of
to
your
you.
screen,
One being
and you'll see it says
the
files to
PowerPoint
download.
that I've
A
just
couple
gone
of
through the
files in there,
presentation with
the
the formulas in
sentiment
it if you want
lexicon
to do this in
and
Excel,
the
and the
slide
other one
deck
being the sentiment
analytics
lexicon
final.
with 8,000
To actually
words that are
download them,
commonly
if you
used
click
in
on
L&D that you can go away and play about with.
document that you
You
wish,
can't
the
break
file that
anything.
you wish, that will then enable the download button. When you click on that, it launches your browser, and there's another download link from that browser, and it's from there that you can then download it to your device and your location of preference. So please make use of that. We've still got about 1 minute. Let's see if I can pick out one last question, Derek. John asks, how far away are we from a cross-industry data resource, real learning and development?
Awesome. So that I miss conferences, face-to-face conferences, and one of the things I was thinking about before this one is I would love to rock up to a conference face-to-face, perhaps next summer's or next year's Learning Technologies conference, and look at someone's name badge and not just see their name, okay, but see e-learning boring or see classroom engaging, right? To see people having used this to say what their problems are pinned on their chest, because actually then we can start to have conversations across industries and across modalities to say what works in one industry, what doesn't work in another industry. You can start to share knowledge. Now, there is nothing stopping people getting together. So if you're in a manufacturing industry and you start asking this question, okay, describe your experience in one word, and you've got a friend on LinkedIn who works in retail fashion, okay, who's asking the same question, there's nothing stopping you sharing your results and saying, I'm getting a large proportion of people saying X within this modality.
People can get hold of you on your,
and they'll say, I'm getting Y in this modality, etc. And you can share, and you can go across industry and across modality
really
because it's the same question.
Entertaining session, Derek.
So how far away are we from doing it?
I'm going to stop recording the meeting and then I will finish off for the day. Thank you very much, everybody.